Up where we left off. We were just about to start talking about the Holy Roman Empire. So, it's really the epitome of political decentralization in the medieval era, right? We already talked about how France was the exception. You can't get much more decentralized than what you can see here, right? The reason why it was called the Holy Roman Empire was that in 962 CE, the German king Otto I was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. But obviously, he's not Roman, he's German, right? So he's given the title because it's harkening back to Charlemagne's title as the Emperor of the Romans. So, in a lot of ways, they're trying to continue that prestige with the title, even though obviously the Roman era is long gone. Right. So Otto's successors survived the power struggle with the papacy over a controversy in the 11th and 12th century called the lay investiture controversy. So basically, what it was whether a secular leader, instead of the Pope, could invest bishops with the symbols of office. So basically, could a king appoint bishops or archbishops or people like that, right? And in 1122 CE, this issue of lay investiture was resolved with the Concordat of Worms in Germany, or in the Holy Roman Empire, but it's now present-day Germany. And the church achieved autonomy from secular authorities during the Concordat of Worms, so sort of a victory for the church in that agreement. So the Holy Roman Empire, despite the fact that it's very politically decentralized, it remains very vibrant until the 16th century, when the 30 Years' War breaks out. And that's a big issue in European history. We will touch upon it in this course. But this really, the 30 Years' War signals the beginning of the end for the Holy Roman Empire. But that weakens it. It continues in name until the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century, and then after that, it ceases to exist. Then it eventually unifies, it becomes Germany, which we'll get to. So, what's happening in England during the medieval era? So we call this period Norman England because of the Norman invasion. The Norman people were descendants of Vikings who settled in the northwest corner of France. So that was a region that is now referred to as Normandy. If you're a big World War II history buff, you might be familiar with the beaches of Normandy, right? Saving Private Ryan. That's the Normandy we're talking about. So in the Norman invasion was in 1066 CE, and that was when William the Conqueror, who was a Norman monarch, invaded England across the English Channel. And after that, he ruled both kingdoms simultaneously. So he ruled both England and France, which you can't see here in this map. During that time, William the Conqueror presided over a tightly organized feudal system. He used royal sheriffs as his administrative officials. And William also standardized law codes issued by his royal court. Over time, objections to William and his successors led to limits on their power in England. And in 1215 CE, the Magna Carta was signed by King John under pressure from leading nobles. So this required the king to observe certain rights, such as the right to a jury trial before a noble could be sentenced to prison. The nobles won the right to be consulted on the issue of scutage, which is a form of tax placed on a knight who wanted to buy his way out of military service. And then in 1265, the first English Parliament formed. And that matters because basically what we're seeing is that already, even though this is only the 13th century, there is this challenge to absolute monarchy in place in England. The first major challenge is by the nobles, so it's not it's not like a crazy revolution, but the nobles are vying with the monarch for power when they have King John sign the Magna Carta. And then as time goes on, after they have a parliament, they have this legislative body that is checking the king's power. That varies in terms of strength. The parliament sometimes doesn't meet for decades at a time. But what I think is important about this is that if we look at it in the big picture, the fact that England came first in Western Europe in terms of this balance of power between the monarch and some other political body shows us why England is the first of all Western European countries to develop a parliamentary democracy, right? So that's something that certainly is important in the grand scheme of things. So, further evidence that things are not going particularly well in Western Europe during the medieval era can be found in the 30 Years, or the 100 Years' War, rather. 30 Years' War comes later. The 100 Years' War, despite the title, actually lasted 113 years. Am I right on my 116? Yeah, there we go, 116 years. And the reason why it matters is because it results in respective nationalism for both sides. It's a war between England and France. And ultimately, France, there's no true victor per se. You don't need to know any of the major battles, but here's what happens. There are two rival monarchies in England and France. England ends up attempting to win all these disputed land claims, right? So England is trying, it's hard to see, but England is trying to take over these parts of France. Everything that is green is England, everything that's orange is France. At their peak, the English controlled basically half of France. But then the tables turn. Ultimately, France gains back all of the territory it had lost to the English, with the exception of one small port city in northern France called Calais. So one of the reasons why the French end up winning is because of Joan of Arc. You've probably heard of her. She was tried for witchcraft. She was burned at the stake. Yep, that Joan of Arc. But her military leadership in the 100 Years' War allowed her to raise an army, and her victories generated a lot of enthusiasm in France. She wanted the future king to be crowned in a city that at that point had been occupied by the English. That happened. So despite the fact that Joan was eventually captured by the English and executed, she still is a major symbol for French nationalism, right? And she was later canonized. So, other things that we should know about the 100 Years' War in terms of military technology, gunpowder was used in the 100 Years' War. Although the British longbow was the more popular weapon, and one of the reasons why the British had early successes in the war. So gunpowder was invented by the Chinese, but it was brought to the Middle East by the Mongols and then eventually spread all the way to Western Europe. So the fact that we see gunpowder use during the 100 Years' War shows us how widespread global trade is. Also, there were many horses used in the 100 Years' War, which shows us how much trade contact there is with the Mongols as well, because Mongols also introduced the horse to the Western world. In the 11th century, the Normans also conquered the island of Sicily, which is in the Mediterranean, and that island had previously been under Muslim rule. So that shows us that in the medieval era, the Norman conquest was pretty significant. So in terms of religion, going back to religion, let's talk about the Reconquista in Spain. So you probably remember from, what was it, period 2, I think? That was early period 3. Holy cow, there's a lot of stuff in period 3, huh? When we talk about the great Muslim kingdoms, you might remember that the Umayyads ended up actually spreading into Western Europe via Spain. They got as far as Tours in France. But there was still a pretty significant Muslim presence in the Iberian Peninsula during the medieval era. So the Reconquista, I don't speak Spanish, but I believe it just means reconquer. My French suggests that. So in any case, what it was this long process. You can see from the dates, it didn't happen overnight, but it was this process of the Castilians, or the Spanish, to regain all the territory that they had previously lost from the Umayyads. These, not only were they Spanish, but they were also Catholic, so it was just as much of a religious war as a political one. And the Reconquista was complete in the year 1492. a year that is better known for Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic. And there was actually a reason why that was. Columbus's 1492 voyage was in celebration of the Reconquista. So a lot of people don't realize that, right? That we tend to focus more on the Columbian voyage, right? What's really important, I would argue, is what's happening with religion in Europe during this period. So in any case, this was complete. The Reconquista happened when Ferdinand and Isabella of Castile were ruling Spain. So it was a very, very high period of strength for Spain. But it was a very bad period for religious minorities who were living in the Iberian Peninsula because virtually all Jews, Muslims, Moors were expelled, normally into North Africa. All right, so the medieval era, we do break it up into two parts, right? The early Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages. So there's no real pinpoint start date for the High Middle Ages, but we tend to say around 1000 CE is when they start. So the Great Schism is sort of in the later half. What you see is that things start to get better for parts of Europe. Not for everybody, but for some. Some of this is just for environmental reasons, right? Temperatures gradually increase during the High Middle Ages. But in any case, by about 1000 CE, we see that the growth of new states and Europeans' increasing interest in foreign goods led Western Europe toward a more progressive period. The Crusades, actually, it was ironic because the Crusades were a religious war, but the fact that there were so many Western European soldiers in Eastern areas meant that they had an increased interest and demand for foreign products, right? So ironically, they're going to this place to fight these people, and nonetheless, they want some of their culture, right? So the High Middle Ages, that sort of interest in all things foreign, is partially a result of that cultural exchange that happens in the Crusades. The weakening of feudalism is also one of the reasons why some stronger political states emerge, right? Monarchs are able to gain more power because nobles have less. Also, trade starts to increase. Some of this is because there is, again, an increased demand for these products. Even if technically during the Crusades this is treacherous territory, when the price is right, the trade will happen. Social and political changes produce new forms of monarchies. And eventually, the Renaissance comes about, right? The Renaissance was a French word for rebirth. And what this does is it totally changes commerce, class relations, gender roles, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the future. European lords and knights retreated from fighting each other in battles, and instead they started to have tournaments or jousts, which we tend to associate quite a bit with the Middle Ages, right? You think about Renaissance fair, medieval times, stuff like that, there's always jousts. There's a reason why these occurred, right? Is that knights still wanted to have a high position in society, but there was less of a need for them to actually fight. And so this was a way to keep knights busy, essentially. And it was also a way to entertain the masses, right? So these jousts actually were, you would use blunt objects. You were using wooden poles instead of actual swords. So at least in theory, you weren't supposed to be hurting your opponent, although some people did get hurt. So the point wasn't actually to be violent. The point was just to entertain people. So that shows us that feudalism is on the decline, right? Because knights have less of a purpose, and now their purpose is almost for show. So that's definitely significant. Let's talk about the Crusades, and then we'll take a break. So, the Crusades are, again, just like the Reconquista, it's not a one-and-done thing. It took a while. They occurred all throughout the 11th, 12th, and early 13th century. And even though there were 4 different Crusades, they all essentially had the same purpose, and that was to try to claim the Holy Land. So the Levant, as it is often referred to, is the Middle East, right? It is Israel, it is Syria, it is Lebanon. It is basically this place. It's mainly Israel, quite frankly, and the significance of it is shared with Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike. So there's a lot of tension between these three major religions in this area. And the Crusades represents one period when this tension comes to a head. So the Christians end up on four separate campaigns trying to reclaim control of this Holy Land. At this point, this was ruled by Muslims. This was part of the Abbasid dynasty. No, my bad, not the Abbasids, the Seljuk Turks. Anyway, I don't know where my brain was. Yes, anyway, it was the Seljuk Turks that were ruling this region. They took control in 1071 CE. Basically, Christians end up trying to fight the Turks to get this land. One of the reasons why so many knights were willing to fight in the Crusades was because of what we already discussed, just the significance of the church, right? The idea that it is part of your feudal duty to go to war. And another thing that is motivating some people to go to the Crusades is primogeniture. What that is a system where only the oldest male inherits his father's fortune. So basically what that means is that if you're anybody but the oldest man, so if you're a second, third, fourth born son, or God forbid if you're a woman, you are not going to get anything after your parents die. So if you are a victim, for lack of a better word, of primogeniture, joining the military was a good scenario for you. So many people who did not benefit from primogeniture ended up going off to fight in the Crusades. And so there was not a dearth of soldiers in the Crusades. There were also economic reasons for the Crusades. There were high demands for Eastern goods. The Silk Road obviously was not what it was, but there still was a demand for Eastern products, right? And the problem was that as Islam spread, the Eastern and Western worlds were increasingly cut off from one another, and the desire for those goods remained. This is also the time when Marco Polo goes to China and comes back with stories of exotic goods from Asia. Actually, that's slightly after the Crusades, but my point is that this interest in the East is major. And so the Crusades, it's ironic because they're fighting against Eastern people, but they also want their stuff, right? Another thing is that the church actually promised things to certain people if they fought in the Crusades. So they would grant absolutions. Occasionally, they would, what else would they do? They would offer acts of atonement or penance if people joined the Crusades. So basically, it was sort of like indulgences, right? Although maybe a more dangerous version of them, if you know what those are. And it recruited quite a few soldiers, right? So it was successful. And another thing that's interesting, if you remember, this is after the Great Schism, right? It's about 40 years after the Great Schism. Even though the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church are split at this point, the Eastern Orthodox Church supports the Crusades. So this shows us that some elements of Christendom are still shared, right? The Orthodox Patriarch at Constantinople actually appealed to the Pope, who was Urban II at the time, to retake the Holy Land from Muslim control. So that shows you that these people are definitely communicating and supporting each other despite the fact that they split. Just really briefly, you don't need to know all these Crusades, but the first and the fourth, I'll just talk about those really quickly. So the First Crusade was the only real clear victory for Christendom. That's the red line. Crusaders conquered Jerusalem in 1099 CE. But by 1187 CE, the Muslims end up regaining control of Jerusalem. So it was a temporary gain for them. And then the fourth and last crusade was from 1202 to 1204. And Venice, which was the wealthiest city-state in northern Italy, had a contract to transport crusaders to the Middle East. They called the Middle East the Levant. And Venice was not paid all of what it was due. So the Venetians actually persuaded the Crusader debtors to sack Zara, which was an Italian city, and then Constantinople, which was a trade competitor of Venice. So the Fourth Crusade instead ended up being more of an economic venture than a religious one, which is interesting. But nonetheless, it certainly shows us why the Crusades were not solely a religious venture, they were definitely economic as well. So, in terms of the Crusades, if we were to evaluate them as a whole, they do not last forever. Christendom does not spread back into the Levant. It is still a predominantly Muslim part of the world at this point. The other effects in terms of just the global significance is that there was an increased knowledge of the world beyond Western Europe. So the great thinkers of the Arabic world that we've already discussed, Indian knowledge, the Arabic numeral system, so many of these preservations of knowledge that continued when the Europeans were falling into decay are reintroduced to Europe. So that's really interesting. Actually, ancient Greek and Roman texts sometimes were better preserved by non-Westerners than they were by Westerners. So those things actually trigger the Renaissance eventually. Also, in terms of the economic significance, we see that there's an increased European demand for Eastern products. The spread of the Black Death is not so good of an effect. That ends up spreading via trade routes, and it's a huge epidemic that is at its peak from 1347 to 1351 in Western Europe, results in about 25 million deaths. The plague was not just those 4 years, though. There were outbreaks afterward for about 100 years. But the long-term impact of the plague is that there was a shortage of labor with so many people dying, and eventually that introduced new economic opportunities for the people that survived. Crusaders also provided some temporary answers to some growing challenges to the church for reforms and monarchs. So the Pope's call for military conquest of the Holy Land brought fighting forces of Western Europe together under the Christian banner and stopped squabbling under local rulers. And in the long term, exposure to new ideas from Byzantium and the Muslim world would contribute to the Renaissance and the subsequent rise of secularism. So basically, the Crusades, even though they happen about 100, 150 years before the Renaissance truly begins, they're definitely a trigger to the Renaissance nonetheless. All right, so let's pick up with economic and social change in just a bit. So stay tuned and thanks.